There are moments of pure, unadulterated suburban bliss that almost make the soul-crushing mortgage feel worth it. This was one of them. The sun was setting, painting the sky in obnoxious shades of orange and purple that you only see on postcards. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. In the center of my meticulously manicured, newly fenced backyard, my little $80 portable fire pit was crackling merrily. I had a beer sweating in one hand and a marshmallow impaled on a stick in the other, slowly rotating it to achieve that perfect, gooey, golden brown state of grace. This was it, the American dream, or at least the cheap, flammable version of it. I'd bought this house 6 months ago, escaping a cramped apartment for the promise of a yard, a garage, and the freedom to walk around in my underwear without giving the neighbors across the alley a free show. This little patch of green was my sanctuary, my escape from debugging code and answering emails that started with, "Just circling back." The fire pit was the crown jewel of this kingdom. It wasn't much, just a simple metal bowl on legs, but it was a portal to simpler times. To scout camp, to family vacations, to a time before property taxes. I leaned back in my camping chair, the marshmallow now sagging perfectly, and sighed a contented sigh that seemed to vibrate with the frequency of pure peace. And that's when a shadow fell over me. It was a long, sharp shadow, and it belonged to a woman holding a clipboard as if it were a tactical shield. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. The aura of joy-sucking vigilance preceded her. It was Carol. HOA President Carol from 2 houses down. Her official title, I believe, was chairperson of the Architectural Control Committee, which sounded like something out of a dystopian novel. "Good evening, Alexander," she said. Her voice had the pleasant, melodic quality of a smoke detector with a dying battery. I squinted up at her, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. "Hey, Carol. Beautiful night, isn't it?" "It is," she agreed, though her eyes weren't on the sunset. They were locked on my fire pit with the intensity of a predator eyeing a wounded gazelle. I couldn't help but notice the open flame. "Yeah, just toasting a marshmallow," I said, wiggling the stick for emphasis. "Want one?" A muscle in her jaw twitched. It might have been a repressed smile, or perhaps she was fighting off a sudden stroke. "While the spirit of community is appreciated," she began, a phrase I was quickly learning meant prepare for a lecture. "I do feel obligated to remind you about community standards regarding airborne particulates and potential fire hazards. It's a controlled burn," I said, gesturing to the tiny sputtering logs. "I think the county fire department would classify this as adorable. I've got a hose right there." She made a little tisk sound. "It's not about the immediate danger, Alexander. It's about the rules. They are in place to protect all of our property values." She tapped her clipboard. "An open flame can be quite an eyesore for those who prefer an unobstructed view." An eyesore? My humble little fire pit? Her house was painted a shade of beige, so offensively bland it was practically invisible. If anything was an eyesore, it was the soulless conformity she championed. "Well, I'll be sure to keep it from getting too out of hand," I said, my voice dripping with a cheerfulness I did not feel. "Wouldn't want to obstruct the view of Dave's chain-link fence over there." She didn't appreciate my humor. Her lips formed a thin, bloodless line. "I would recommend you review your copy of the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, specifically Section 7. She turned without another word and marched back toward her beige fortress, her posture as rigid as a 2x4. The shadow lifted, but the peace was gone, replaced by a nagging sense of dread. 3 days later, the other shoe dropped. It arrived not in a regular envelope, but in a stiff, cream-colored one delivered via certified mail, requiring a signature. This was the paper equivalent of sending a SWAT team. My hands trembled slightly as I tore it open. The letterhead was aggressively ornate. Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association. The language within was a masterclass in bureaucratic passive aggression. Dear Mr. Alexander Sterling, this letter serves as a formal notice regarding a violation of the Oakhaven Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and Rs. It has been observed by the Architectural Control Committee that a non-compliant structure has been erected on your property located at 124 Willow Creek Lane, as per Article 7, Section 14, subsection B3. No temporary or permanent fire-containing structures, including but not limited to fire pits, chimeneas, or open-air hearths, intended for recreational, aesthetic, or heating purposes, shall be permitted on any lot. You are hereby instructed to cease and desist all use of said structure and to remove it from your property within 10 business days of the date of this letter. Failure to comply will result in an initial fine of $50, followed by subsequent fines of $25 per day until the violation is rectified. I read it twice, then a third time. They were threatening to fine me into oblivion over an $80 fire pit I bought at a hardware store. Recreational, aesthetic, or heating purposes. What other purpose was there? Was I supposed to be using it for ritual sacrifice? My blood began to simmer. This wasn't about property values or safety. This was about power. It was about Carol and her clipboard, and the pathetic thrill she got from squashing any spark of individuality in her beige little kingdom. I crumpled the letter in my fist, the thick, expensive paper crackling in protest. My simple dream of a backyard sanctuary had been invaded. This was a declaration of war. I looked at the crumpled letter, then out my window at my sad, empty fire pit. A slow, devious smile spread across my face. Okay, Carol, you want to play by the book? Let's read the whole damn library. The Oakhaven Estates HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions was not a document. It was a weapon of mass depression. 200 pages of dense, single-spaced legalese, bound in a cheap 3-ring binder, and written in a language that was technically English, but had all the soul and clarity of a software license agreement. For the next 3 nights, that binder was my Bible, my Talmud, my Rosetta Stone of suburban misery. I sat at my kitchen table, highlighter in one hand, a glass of cheap whiskey in the other, and I dove in. It was a journey into the heart of petty darkness. I discovered rules I couldn't have imagined in my wildest fever dreams. Article 4, Section 8. All residential mailboxes must be of the classic Keystone model in either obsidian black or satin bronze. There was a footnote detailing the approved brands. Article 9, Section 3. No garden statuary, including but not limited to gnomes, flamingos, or stylized woodland creatures, shall exceed a height of 18 inches. I made a mental note to buy a 19-inch gnome and name him Carol. Article 21, Section 12A. Holiday-themed exterior lighting and decorations may be displayed no earlier than the day following Thanksgiving, and must be removed no later than 21 days following the federally observed holiday. I pictured Carol driving around on January 16th with a stopwatch and a citation pad. The whole document was a testament to the idea that if you give a person a tiny sliver of power, they will build a bureaucratic empire upon it. I felt a strange mix of despair and awe. This wasn't just a set of rules, it was a life philosophy, and I was in violation of it. But before I surrendered to madness, I decided to try one last appeal to what I hoped was a deeply buried, microscopic shred of human decency. I saw my moment the next afternoon. Carol was retrieving her mail. a single sad-looking coupon circular from her satin bronze's classic Keystone mailbox. I took a deep breath and approached, wearing my most non-threatening, "Hey neighbor," smile. "Hey Carol, got a second?" She turned, and her eyes narrowed slightly. "Alexander, I trust you received our correspondence." "Loud and clear," I said, keeping my tone light. "That's actually what I wanted to talk about. Look, I get it, rules are rules. But the fire pit is a portable unit. It's safe, it's clean, and honestly, it's tucked away behind my house. No one can even see it unless they're peeking over the fence. Is there any kind of variance or appeal process we can go through?" Carol adjusted the collar on her polo shirt, which was, of course, a perfectly HOA-approved shade of taupe. "Alexander, the rules are the rules for a reason," she recited, as if reading from an invisible teleprompter. "They protect our property values. An open flame is an insurance liability and, frankly, an eyesore." "An $80 bowl is a threat to the entire neighborhood's property value?" I asked, a bit of an edge creeping into my voice. "Come on." "We can't make exceptions," she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper, as if she were letting me in on a grave secret. "It creates a slippery slope. It's a matter of precedent. First, we allow one unapproved fire pit. Then what? Tire swings? Cars on blocks? People painting their doors unapproved shades of crimson?" She shuddered at the thought. The sheer, unadulterated absurdity of it almost made me laugh. I was a gateway drug to neighborhood anarchy. My marshmallow habit was going to lead directly to rusted-out Chevys on front lawns. "So there's no room for discussion at all?" I pressed. "The decision of the committee is final," she said, turning to leave. "You have 7 business days remaining." I walked back to my house, defeated. The appeal to reason had failed because I had foolishly assumed I was dealing with a reasonable person. Carol wasn't a person. She was an algorithm. A fleshy automaton, programmed to enforce the beige agenda. Fine. If I couldn't beat the system with logic, I'd beat it with its own twisted logic. That night, fueled by righteous indignation and the last of the cheap whiskey, I went back to the binder. I wasn't just reading anymore. I was hunting. I scanned every line, every footnote, every appendix. My eyes were burning, my brain was turning to mush, and I was about to give up and just buy the tallest, most offensive garden gnome I could find online. And then I saw it. It was buried deep in a section about property improvements. It was a single, beautiful sentence that shone like a beacon in the fog of legalese. The bylaw that outlawed my fire pit was brutally specific. Recreational, aesthetic, or heating purposes. But several pages later, under a completely different article titled Permanent Fixtures and Ancillary Structures, was a list of permissible additions. The list included barbecue grills, smokers, and, my heart skipped a beat, fixed foundation ovens for culinary purposes. Culinary purposes. The words echoed in my head. A fixed foundation oven. An oven. Not for recreation, not for aesthetics, for cooking. It was a loophole. A glorious, smoke-filled, technically by-the-book loophole. I shot up from my chair, the binder clattering to the floor. My mind was racing. A fixed foundation, professionally installed, adhering to county building codes. It was all there. I could build something big, something permanent, something that Carol, with her slavish devotion to the written word, could not possibly object to. A vision appeared in my mind's eye. It was magnificent. A towering structure of brick and mortar, a monument to malicious compliance. It wouldn't be a fire pit. Oh no. It would be a culinary appliance. A magnificent, wood-fired, Neapolitan-style brick pizza oven. I started laughing. A wild, unhinged cackle that probably had my neighbors checking their locks. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. and I was about to bring out the heavy artillery. The next morning, I woke up with a constitutional law-sized hangover and a singular mission: to find an artisan of spite. A mason who could see my vision and understand that this wasn't just a construction project, it was a performance piece. My initial phone calls were less than fruitful. "Hello, Johnson Masonry. Yes, I'm looking to get a quote on a custom brick pizza oven for my backyard." "Sure thing, buddy. What size you thinking?" "Large," I said. "Substantial. I want it to be visible from a specific neighbor's kitchen window." There was a long pause on the other end. Right. Is this, for a catering business or something?" "No, it's primarily for annoying a woman named Carol." Click. The second call went similarly. The guy from Brick by Brick Construction listened patiently to my plans, my emphasis on permanence, on its culinary purpose, and its strategic placement. "Son," he said, his voice thick with a southern drawl, "it sounds to me like you're about to spend $5,000 to win a $50 argument. You sure about that?" He wasn't wrong, but he was missing the point. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. After 3 more rejections, I was starting to lose hope. I scrolled through online listings, past polished corporate websites, until I found a grainy, low-res ad for Gus's Masonry and Stonework. "No job too weird, call Gus." The ad featured a picture of a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite, and then left out in the sun for 60 years. He had a magnificent mustache and was holding a trowel like it was the hammer of Thor. I dialed the number. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. "Gus." "Hi, Gus. My name is Alex. I found your ad online. I have what you might consider a weird job." "Kid, I once built a retaining wall shaped like a mermaid for a guy in exchange for a used jet ski. Try me." I laid out the whole story. The house, the fire pit, the certified letter, Carol, the binder, the loophole. I didn't leave anything out. When I was done, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. I thought maybe he'd hung up. Then I heard a low rumble, which grew into a deep, booming laugh. It was the sound of a man who had seen the absurdity of the world and decided to laugh back at it. "A spite oven!" he roared. "Oh, that's beautiful! That's the best damn thing I've heard all year. I'm in." Gus came over that afternoon. In person, he was even more glorious than his photo. He was built like a retired refrigerator, with hands like catcher's mitts and a handshake that could pulverize walnuts. He walked into my backyard, took one look at the spot where my fire pit used to be, and nodded grimly. "So this is the scene of the crime," he said. He looked over the fence toward Carol's house. "Beige, of course it is. And which one is her window?" I pointed. "The kitchen, right there." "Perfect," he grunted. "She'll get the morning sun glinting off the chimney, a daily reminder of her failure." We were kindred spirits. He wasn't just a contractor. He was a co-conspirator. We spent the next hour pacing the yard like 2 generals planning an invasion. He sketched designs on a notepad, his thick fingers surprisingly nimble. "We don't just build an oven," he declared, his eyes gleaming. "We build a fortress of flavor, a bastion of bread. We'll use reclaimed Chicago brick for character, a proper barrel-vaulted roof for heat retention, a terracotta chimney that meets county code for height, plus a few extra inches just to be safe, and we'll lay a stone patio around it, make it look like it's always been here." "How big can we legally make it?" I asked, my voice filled with a giddy sense of possibility. Gus grinned, showing a row of teeth that had seen better days. "Kid, how much you got?" We settled on a design that was both magnificent and, to any reasonable person, complete overkill for a guy who just wanted to make a few pizzas. It was less of a backyard oven and more of an industrial bakery that had gotten lost in the suburbs. Gus, a master of his craft and an expert navigator of municipal red tape, drew up the official plans. He knew every code, every setback requirement, every permit application by heart. "The key," he explained, tapping the blueprints, "is to be more bureaucratic than the bureaucrats. We'll submit this to the county and get our building permit before we even show it to the HOA. That way, when little Miss Carroll tries to shut us down, we can show her a legally binding permit from an actual government entity. Her little binder won't mean squat." It was a brilliant strategy. We were flanking her with a superior force of paperwork. A week later, with the county permit secured, I drafted the most polite, professional, and utterly galling letter of my life. I attached the blueprints, the permit, and a copy of the relevant HOA bylaw about fixed foundation ovens, highlighting the key phrases. "To the Oakhaven Estates Architectural Control Committee, please find attached my proposal for a property improvement at 124 Willow Creek Lane, in accordance with Article C8 of the CC&Rs. The project consists of the installation of a permanent, fixed foundation culinary oven and adjoining patio space. All designs and materials are in compliance with county building codes, as evidenced by the attached permit. I look forward to your timely approval so that construction may commence. Sincerely, Alexander Sterling." I sealed the envelope, put a stamp on it, and walked it down to the community mailbox myself. I imagined Carol opening it. I imagined the confusion, the dawning horror, the impotent rage as she realized that I had followed her precious rules to the letter, using them to build a monument to the very thing she had tried to destroy. I could almost hear the grinding of her teeth from my front porch. The first brick had been laid, and it was a brick of pure, unadulterated spite. The approval letter from the HOA arrived exactly 2 weeks later, as dictated by their own procedural bylaws. It was a masterpiece of begrudging consent. There was no friendly greeting, no well wishes for the project. It was a single, curt sentence on the same ornate letterhead. "The committee has reviewed your submission and, finding it in technical compliance with the CC&Rs, hereby grants its approval." I could feel the rage seething between the lines. Carol had been legally checkmated, and she knew it. I framed the letter. The following Monday, Operation Pepperoni Dawn commenced. At precisely 8 a.m., a flatbed truck rumbled down our quiet suburban street, groaning under the weight of 2 pallets of reclaimed Chicago brick and a dozen bags of mortar. The hydraulic lift whined as it deposited the materials at the end of my driveway. It was a beautiful, industry-grade eyesore. Across the street, a curtain twitched in the Hendersons' window. They were Carol's loyal lieutenants, a retired couple whose only hobby seemed to be chronicling the minor infractions of their neighbors. 30 seconds later, Carol herself appeared on her front porch, clad in a pastel pink tracksuit. She stood motionless, her arms crossed, watching the proceedings like a deposed monarch observing the barbarian horde at her gates. Gus arrived shortly after in his beat-up Ford Ranger, whistling a cheerful, off-key tune. He took one look at Carol, then at me, and winked. "The Queen is observing her domain," he muttered. "All right, Alex, let's give her a show." The first day was a flurry of activity. Gus and his 2-man crew, a couple of quiet guys named Marco and Luis, started by digging the foundation. The rhythmic scrape of their shovels was, to me, the sweetest music. To Carol, apparently, it was a declaration of war. At 9:01 a.m., my phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Mr. Sterling? This is the City Code Enforcement Office. We've received a noise complaint from your address." "A noise complaint?" I asked, looking out at the 3 men quietly digging a hole with hand tools. "What kind of noise?" "The report says, disruptive scraping and grunting." I had to cover the phone to keep from laughing. "Officer, it's a construction site. It's 9 in the morning. I assure you the grunting is well within the legal decibel limit." The officer sighed, the sound of a man who dealt with Carrolls all day long. "Just keep it down," he said, and hung up. Day 2, the harassment escalated. As Gus was marking out the exact footprint of the oven with stakes and string, Carroll marched over, clipboard in hand. "Excuse me," she announced. "I've just reviewed the official plot survey from 2008. I believe your intended structure is encroaching on the community common area by at least 6 inches. Gus, who had been hunched over, straightened up slowly. He wiped the sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of dirt. He looked at her, then at his string, then back at her. He didn't say a word. He just walked over to his truck, rummaged around in the cab, and returned with a rolled-up tube. He unfurled it on my lawn. It was a brand-new certified survey of my property, stamped and sealed by a licensed surveyor just last week. "Ma'am," Gus said, his voice as dry as cement dust. "According to this survey, which is a damn sight more current than whatever you got in your files, we're not just inside the property line. We've got a good 2 feet to spare. But if you'd like to pay for another surveyor to come out and confirm, be my guest." Carol's face went pale, then pink. She snatched her old survey from her clipboard, stared at it, then at Gus's, and without a word, spun on her heel and retreated. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. The next day, we discovered her new tactic: biological warfare. Just as Marco and Luis started mixing a fresh batch of mortar, the sprinkler system on Carol's side yard sputtered to life with uncanny accuracy. A high-powered stream of water arched directly over the fence, dousing their carefully measured pile of dry mix. "Son of a—" Gus started, before catching himself. He just shook his head and sighed. "All right, boys. Tarp over the materials. Looks like we're in for some unexpected showers." The neighborhood was definitely taking notice. My next-door neighbor, Dave, a chill software engineer with a perpetually amused expression, came over that evening holding a 6-pack. "Dude," he said, handing me a beer, "my wife and I have been watching this all week. It's better than Netflix. Is this really all because she made you get rid of that little fire pit?" "This is the direct and proportional response," I said, taking a long pull from the bottle. "It's a thing of beauty," he said, looking at the half-finished foundation. "A masterpiece of spite. Let me know if you need a character witness." Meanwhile, the Hendersons were providing a constant stream of intelligence back to Carol. Every time Gus used a power tool, every time a delivery was made, Mrs. Henderson would peer through her blinds, cordless phone pressed to her ear. They were the Stasi of suburban Oak Haven. The construction continued, a slow, methodical process. Each brick Gus laid felt like a small act of defiance. He and his crew were meticulous, their craftsmanship a stark contrast to the petty chaos Carol was trying to sow. We worked through the noise complaints, the property line disputes, and the accidental dousings. With every new layer of brick, the structure grew, and with it, my resolve. This was no longer just about getting back at Carol. It was about building something solid and real in the face of flimsy, arbitrary rules. It was about proving that a man's backyard was his castle, even if he had to build the damn thing one spiteful brick at a time. After 2 weeks of meticulous work, the day finally came. Gus laid the final brick on the chimney, smoothing the mortar with a flourish. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his dusty jeans, and joined me on the lawn to admire our creation. It was glorious, more magnificent than I had ever imagined. The oven was a behemoth of brick and mortar, a rustic, domed masterpiece that looked like it had been teleported directly from the Italian countryside and dropped into the middle of a deeply beige American suburb. The reclaimed Chicago brick gave it an aged, timeless quality, and the terracotta chimney soared towards the sky, a proud finger directed squarely at Carol's house. The stone patio Gus had insisted on tied it all together, making it feel less like an addition and more like the backyard's entire reason for being. "Well, kid," Gus said, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. "There she is, the great spite oven of Oakhaven. She's a beaut." "It's more than beautiful, Gus," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It's perfect." "Now I wrote down the curing instructions for you," he said, handing me a piece of paper. "You gotta do a series of small fires, build them up slow to dry out the masonry. Don't rush it, or you'll crack the dome." He paused, a twinkle in his eye. "But for that very first fire, I suggest you use something with a little symbolic value." He presented me with his final invoice. I noticed he'd knocked a significant amount off the total. "Gus, this is less than we agreed on," I said. He just waved a dismissive hand. "Consider it my contribution to the cause. The entertainment value of watching that woman's face contort every day was worth at least $500. Call it a visual comedy discount." We shook hands, a firm, dusty grip of mutual respect and shared victory. That evening, as the sun began to set, I performed the christening. I crumpled up the original certified letter from the HOA, the one that had started this whole absurd journey, and placed it inside the oven's gaping maw. On top of it, I laid some kindling and a few small logs. I struck a match. The paper caught fire instantly, the aggressive letterhead turning brown, then black, then to ash. A thin tendril of smoke curled up the new chimney. It was the most satisfying fire I had ever started. For the next week, I followed Gus's instructions religiously, curing the oven with a series of increasingly larger fires. I also fell down a deep, obsessive rabbit hole of YouTube videos about pizza making. I learned about dough hydration, fermentation times, the optimal temperature of Neapolitan-style pizza, a blistering 900 degrees Fahrenheit, and the subtle art of launching a pizza off a peel without it folding into a calzone of shame. My kitchen was perpetually dusted with flour, and my refrigerator was full of experimental dough balls in various stages of proofing. Finally, the oven was cured, and my dough recipe was dialed in. It was time for the maiden voyage. I built a roaring fire, letting the oven heat up for over an hour until the internal dome was white hot. My hands were shaking slightly as I stretched my first dough ball, topped it with San Marzano tomato sauce, fresh mozzarella, and basil. I dusted the peel with semolina, slid it under the pizza, took a deep breath, and launched it into the fiery heart of the oven. 90 seconds later, I pulled it out. It was a disaster. One side was charred black, the other was still doughy, and most of the cheese had slid off into the embers. It looked less like a pizza and more like a crime scene. But I didn't care. I had made it. I had cooked in my spite oven. Just as I was contemplating my failure, a voice called over the fence. "Whoa! What is that amazing smell?" It was Dave, my neighbor, peering over the fence with a look of awe on his face. "It's supposed to be a pizza," I said, gesturing to the sad, misshapen disc on the peel. "Smells incredible," he said. Can I try some?" "At your own risk," I laughed. I passed a slice over the fence. He took a bite. His eyes went wide. He chewed thoughtfully, then took another bite. "Dude, the burnt part is a little burnt. But the rest of this is literally the best pizza I have ever had in my life. The crust is amazing. You should sell this stuff." I looked at the monstrous oven, then back at Dave's ecstatic face. A light bulb didn't just go off in my head. It exploded. Sell it? No. Selling it would make me a business, which would give Carol and the HOA an entirely new arsenal of bylaws to use against me. But giving it away wasn't a business. It was just being neighborly. It was a gathering, a party, an act of community, an act of community centered around a giant brick structure that Carol was forced to stare at every single day. The sheer, poetic perfection of it was staggering. The next morning, I went to the hardware store. I bought a small, tasteful cedar plank and a wood-burning kit. My artistic skills were limited, but I carefully etched a simple message into the wood. The lettering was rustic, the sign itself no larger than a standard piece of paper, making it fully compliant with Article 9, Section 17, Rules for Non-Commercial Signage. That afternoon, I hammered the sign into my front lawn, right next to the sidewalk. It was angled for maximum visibility. The message was simple, friendly, and utterly devastating. Free pizza, Fridays, 6 p.m. Bring a chair. I stepped back to admire my handiwork. A few moments later, Carol's front door opened. She emerged to get her mail and froze. She stared at the sign, her face a priceless tableau of confusion, which slowly melted into rage, and then morphed into pure, uncomprehending horror. She knew exactly what I was doing, and she knew there wasn't a damn thing in her binder she could do about it. The game had changed. That first Friday, I was a nervous wreck. The sun began to dip below the horizon, the oven was roaring at a perfect 900 degrees, and my kitchen counter was lined with balls of perfectly proofed dough and bowls of toppings. But my driveway was empty. A profound sense of dread washed over me. What if no one came? What if this grand gesture of community-fueled revenge fell completely flat? I'd just be a weirdo in his backyard with an industrial-grade oven and 50 pounds of mozzarella. Carol would win. The thought was unbearable. At 6:05 p.m., I heard the telltale sound of a lawn chair unfolding. It was Dave, his wife, and their 2 kids, who looked at the massive oven with the same reverence usually reserved for dinosaurs or spaceships. "Are we the first ones?" Dave asked, grinning. "Smells epic in here, man." "You are," I said, my relief so palpable I could have served it on a plate. "What can I get you? Pepperoni? Cheese?" I launched the first 2 pizzas into the oven. As I was pulling them out, golden and bubbling, another family from down the street wandered up my driveway, hesitantly, as if approaching a mythical beast. Is this the pizza house?" the dad asked. "It is indeed," I said, flashing what I hoped was a welcoming smile. "Welcome, have a seat." By 6:30, a dozen people were scattered across my lawn and driveway. By 7 o'clock, there were nearly 30. People I'd only ever nodded to while getting my mail were now sitting in a circle, sharing pizza, introducing themselves, and laughing. The sound was incredible. It was the sound of a neighborhood actually being a neighborhood. I was slinging pizzas like a man possessed, a blur of flour and tomato sauce. Each pie that came out of the oven was met with a little cheer. I caught a glimpse of Carol's house. Her lights were on, but her blinds were drawn tight. I imagined her inside, stewing, listening to the sounds of her carefully curated silence being shattered by the one thing she couldn't legislate against: genuine human connection. The next Friday, even more people came. This time they came prepared. Someone brought a cooler of drinks to share. A woman I'd never met brought a massive Tupperware container full of a killer pasta salad. Someone else started a playlist on a portable speaker. It wasn't my party anymore. It was ours. The conversation inevitably turned to the origin story of the oven, and I would happily recount my tale of the fire pit and the certified letter. Each telling was met with knowing groans, nods of sympathy, and stories of their own run-ins with Carol and the HOA. The oven wasn't just a pizza machine, it was a rallying point for the oppressed. Carol, naturally, was not taking this lying down. Her counteroffensive came via email. On the 3rd week, a neighborhood-wide blast went out from the official HOA account. The subject line: Reminder, community policies on gatherings and nuisances. The email was a work of art. Without mentioning me by name, It spoke of unauthorized, recurring social gatherings, the parking congestion caused by non-residents. My driveway was full, but no one was parking illegally, and the potential health and safety risks associated with unregulated food distribution. It was her entire arsenal of bureaucratic scare tactics. The email had the exact opposite of its intended effect. It was the talk of Pizza Friday that week. People were forwarding it to each other, laughing and reading her passive-aggressive prose aloud with dramatic flair. It solidified my status from that guy with the pizza oven to a full-blown folk hero. The following week, she played her trump card. It was peak Pizza Friday. My yard was packed, kids were drawing with chalk on the driveway, and the smell of garlic and basil hung heavy in the air. Suddenly, a police car, lights off, pulled quietly up to the curb. The music stopped. The chatter died down. Everyone turned to look. Out stepped two officers, a tall, older cop with a weary look on his face, and a younger, sharper-looking female officer. They surveyed the scene, their expressions unreadable. And then from across the street, Carol emerged, marching towards them with her clipboard held high. She had done it. She had called the cops on a pizza party. "Officers, thank God you're here," she announced, her voice ringing with false panic. "This has gotten completely out of control. This man," she said, pointing a trembling finger at me, "is running an unlicensed restaurant from his home. It's a public nuisance, a health code violation, and it's attracting all sorts of people." I wiped my flour-dusted hands on my apron and walked to the end of my driveway. "Evening, officers," I said calmly. The taller officer, whose name tag read Miller, looked from Carol's frantic face to my flour-covered one. He looked at the families sitting peacefully in lawn chairs. He looked at the kids playing hopscotch. He took a long, slow sniff of the air. "Smells good," he said, his face deadpan. He turned to Carol. "Ma'am, what exactly is the crime here?" "The crime?" she sputtered. "He's serving food to the public without a permit. Look at this crowd. It's a public safety hazard." I stepped in. "With all due respect, officers, I'm not a business. I'm not selling anything. I'm giving away free food to my friends and neighbors. Is that illegal?" Officer Miller exchanged a look with his partner. I saw the corner of her mouth twitch. "Ma'am," Miller said, turning back to Carol with an expression of infinite patience. "He's not a restaurant if no money is changing hands. This is a private party on his own property. As long as the noise is at a reasonable level for 7:30 on a Friday night and no one's blocking the public street, there's not a single law being broken." But the bylaws," Carol stammered, waving her clipboard. "We don't enforce HOA bylaws," Miller said, his voice flat. "That's a civil matter. Now, unless there's an actual crime being committed, we have other calls to get to." His partner leaned in slightly towards me and murmured, "That pepperoni looks amazing, by the way." I grinned. "I'll save you a slice for when you're off duty." They got back in their car, gave me a small nod, and drove away. As the cruiser pulled away, a single person started clapping, then another and another. Within seconds, my entire front lawn erupted in applause and cheers. It was a standing ovation. We had faced down the final boss, and we had won. Carol stood frozen on the sidewalk, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated defeat. She had thrown her biggest punch, and it hadn't left a scratch. She turned and scurried back into her beige house, utterly and publicly humiliated. The party that night was the best one yet. Carol was a creature of habit and rules. Public humiliation and the utter failure of law enforcement to bend to her will had wounded her, but it hadn't stopped her. She was like a cornered badger, ready for one last desperate attack. After a week of ominous silence, the email arrived in every inbox in the neighborhood. Subject: urgent. Emergency HOA meeting and vote. All homeowners are required to attend an emergency meeting at the Oakhaven Community Clubhouse this Thursday at 7 p.m. The agenda will be a single item, a proposed amendment to the CC and Rs to clarify and enforce Bylaw 9.4C regarding activities constituting a neighborhood nuisance and the unauthorized operation of home-based businesses, whether for profit or not for profit. This was it, the final showdown. She couldn't get me on existing rules, so she was going to ram through a new one specifically designed to shut me down. The for-profit or not-for-profit language was aimed directly at my heart. A legalistic cruise missile targeted at Pizza Fridays. She was trying to outlaw fun, to outlaw community, to outlaw generosity itself. The news spread like wildfire. Dave called me immediately. "Did you see it? She's making a power play." "I see it," I said, a knot tightening in my stomach. "Don't worry, man," he said. "Everyone's pissed. This isn't about you anymore. This is about her. We're all going to be there." Thursday night, the clubhouse was packed. I had only ever seen the place used for a sparsely attended annual budget meeting. Tonight, there wasn't an empty seat. People were standing along the walls. It looked less like an HOA meeting and more like a town hall on the eve of a revolution. I saw faces I recognized from my lawn, people who had been sharing pizza and laughing together for the past month. They nodded at me as I walked in, little signs of solidarity. Carol stood at a podium at the front of the room, flanked by the Hendersons, who looked deeply uncomfortable with the massive turnout. Carol, however, looked energized. This was her arena. She banged a small gavel. She launched into a prepared speech, a 10-minute tirade against the slow, creeping decay of their suburban paradise. She spoke of unacceptable risks, unknown individuals wandering our streets, potential lawsuits, and the erosion of the quiet, peaceful character of our community. She never used my name, but she painted a picture of my Pizza Fridays as a weekly Mad Max-style bacchanal that threatened to send their property values plummeting to zero. Therefore, she concluded, her voice reaching a crescendo, the board proposes an amendment to Bylaw 9.4C. The new language will explicitly prohibit any recurring event on a residential property that attracts more than 15 non-residents, regardless of whether commerce is conducted. This is a common-sense measure to protect our community. She opened the floor for discussion, a smug look on her face. She clearly expected a quick vote and a return to beige-tinted order. For a moment, there was silence. Then I stood up. "Carol," I said, my voice steady. "My name is Alex Sterling. I live at 124 Willow Creek Lane, and I'm the person this amendment is about." A murmur went through the crowd. "This whole thing started because you told me I couldn't have a small fire pit in my own backyard. A fire pit I used to sit by myself and roast marshmallows. So, I read your rule book. I followed every single line of it. I got the permits, I hired a professional, I built a pizza oven. And when I was done, I decided to share." I turned to address the room. "I didn't know most of you a month ago. I'd see you getting your mail, we'd do the little head nod thing, and that was it. But now I know that Dave's kid is a killer shortstop. I know that Mary from down the street makes a carrot cake that'll change your life. I know the Millers are expecting their first grandchild. This nuisance Carol is talking about, it's us, getting to know each other, building the very community this HOA is supposed to be supporting." I looked back at Carol. "You can't legislate community, and you can't kill it with bylaws. That's all I have to say." As I sat down, the room was silent for a beat, and then Dave stood up. "She's right about one thing," he said. "It has changed the character of the neighborhood. It's made it better. My kids ask me every Monday if it's Pizza Friday yet. I say we vote this ridiculous amendment down." Another neighbor stood up. "I've lived here for 15 years, and it's never been friendlier. This is the best thing to happen to this block." One by one, people stood up to speak, not in anger, but in passionate defense of our new tradition. They spoke of meeting new friends, of their kids having a safe place to play, of finally feeling connected. The Hendersons, Carol's star witnesses, sat frozen in their chairs, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Carol's face had gone from confident to concerned to ashen. She had expected an easy victory, a rubber stamp on her authority. Instead, she had instigated a full-blown mutiny. "We will now vote on the proposed amendment," she finally squeaked, her voice barely a whisper. "All in favor, raise your hand." 3 hands went up. Carol's and the 2 Hendersons. All opposed. A forest of hands shot into the air. It was a landslide. It was a public execution of her power. The motion was so overwhelmingly defeated, it was comical. A wave of applause and cheers washed over the room. Carol just stood at the podium, speechless, her reign of petty tyranny officially over. The aftermath of the great HOA showdown was swift and decisive. Carol didn't just lose the vote. She lost her entire reason for being. Her power was derived from the residents' apathy, from their willingness to let the small rules slide just to avoid a confrontation. But I had poked the bear, and the whole neighborhood had woken up. Stripped of her authority and publicly rebuked, she vanished. Not literally, of course. But she became a ghost in her own beige house. She was no longer seen patrolling with her clipboard. Her furious emails ceased. A week later, a quiet notice was posted on the community message board. Carol had resigned as HOA president and from the Architectural Control Committee, citing personal reasons. Dave, to my immense satisfaction, was elected as the new president a month later on a simple platform. Less time legislating mailbox colors, more time for block parties. The vibe in the neighborhood changed overnight. It was lighter, friendlier. People left their garage doors open. They stopped to chat on the sidewalk. It was like the entire block collectively exhaled. And Pizza Fridays continued. In fact, they got even bigger and better. It became a well-oiled machine. It was no longer just my party, it was a community potluck. People would sign up to bring toppings, salads, desserts. A couple of guys started bringing a portable cornhole set. It became our weekly tradition, the official start to the weekend. I was still the head pizzaiolo, the guy at the heart of the flame, but it was a shared enterprise. Months later, on a perfect late September evening, I found myself in the same spot where this whole ridiculous journey began. The air was crisp, the sky was that same postcard purple, and the yard was full of the sounds of laughter and kids playing. The oven, now beautifully seasoned, was radiating a comfortable heat. I slid a perfect margarita pizza, blistered and bubbling, onto a cutting board. Dave came over and clapped me on the back. "Still can't believe this all started because of that tiny fire pit," he said, shaking his head and grabbing a slice. I looked out at the scene, at the families and friends gathered, sharing food and conversation under the string lights Dave had helped me hang. It was everything I had wanted that first night, just magnified by 100. It was peace. It was community. It was the American dream, just with more garlic. They told me I couldn't have a fire. They tried to extinguish a small, simple joy. So I gave them an inferno of community, cheese, and delicious, delicious justice. And as I took the first bite of the pizza, the smoky, tangy, savory taste filling my mouth, I realized it tasted even better than I had ever imagined. I grinned, holding the peel up high. "Who wants the next one?" I shouted. A chorus of happy voices cheered back.